The courtroom was thick with tension as reporters buzzed with excitement, snapping photos and exchanging murmurs. In the center of it all sat Tiffany Henyard, the self-styled super mayor, exuding defiance, though her eyes betrayed the intensity of the emotion she was trying to hide. She walked into the courtroom with the same unshakable arrogance that had been the hallmark of her entire political career. Her chin held high. She was flanked by a team of lawyers, likely funded by taxpayer dollars, though that didn't seem to faze her. But then the prosecution dropped the bombshell screens lit up with damning evidence. Statements, emails, and secret recordings, all revealing Henyard's role in a web of bribery, backdoor deals, and the misuse of taxpayer money. The very public image she had carefully crafted of a smooth-talking, unassailable political figure began to crack. The woman who had risen to power through manipulation, who had once commanded billboards featuring her face and skimmed over questionable financials, was exposed. She was frozen in place, the color draining from her face as the truth unfolded in front of her. The residents of Dalton, her once loyal supporters, watched in stunned disbelief as the woman they had trusted for years was revealed to be a fraud. But it didn't end there. In a fit of rage, Henyard slammed her fist onto the table so hard that the chair screeched against the polished floor. Standing up, she shouted, "This is a setup!" Her voice cracked with frustration. The room, however, wasn't buying it. The judge's gavel pounded with authority. But Henyard wasn't done. With a pointed finger at the prosecution, she screamed, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony hung thick in the air. Here was a woman who had allegedly used her position to bully local officials, inflate salaries, and funnel money into mysterious projects. Now, she was trying to cast herself as the victim. Classic Henyard in a final, desperate move to salvage her carefully curated image. She turned on her lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this," she yelled, her voice dripping with contempt. One of her attorneys shuffled through papers awkwardly, clearly embarrassed, while the other refused to meet her eyes. The cracks in her empire were glaringly evident now for the first time in her political career. Henyard had no deflections, no spin, no way to control the narrative. The truth had caught up with her, and she was unable to hide it. In a move that shocked everyone, she grabbed her designer handbag, whipped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. The gasps that followed were audible. She was really leaving, abandoning the fight, yes. The room fell into an eerie silence as the once unstoppable mayor of Dalton, the woman who had manipulated the system for so long, walked away. But the silence didn't last. The people who had been manipulated, lied to, and betrayed erupted into applause. Justice had arrived, and Henyard was running out of places to hide. The courthouse exploded into chaos as court officials slammed their desks, shouting for order, while reporters scrambled to catch up with the fleeing mayor. "Did you see her face?" One resident laughed. "I told you she was a crook," shouted another. "This is what happens when you mess with the people's money." Yet another voice chimed in from the crowd inside the courtroom. Henyard's inner circle sat frozen, trying to salvage whatever they could. Phones rang frantically as the fallout set in. No one was safe now. Meanwhile, outside, the media hounded Henyard as she stormed down the courthouse steps. Her heels clicked furiously against the pavement, each step echoing in the tense air. The press swarmed her, bombarding her with questions, their cameras flashing and microphones thrusting toward her face. "Mayor Henyard, do you have a comment on the leaked recordings?" one reporter shouted. "Is it true that millions of taxpayer dollars are missing?" Another pressed. "Will you resign after the day's hearing?" But Henyard remained tight-lipped, her face set in a hard mask of defiance as her security team tried to push the reporters away. The press, however, was relentless, forming an ever-tightening circle of questions, trapping her with no escape. Just when it seemed like Henyard might slip away into the safety of her car, a voice broke through the chaos. A woman stepped forward, blocking her path. It was a former treasurer of Dalton, an unexpected and dramatic twist. This was a woman who had resigned months earlier, citing suspicions of mismanagement and accusing Henyard of unethical conduct. Her eyes were filled with fire as she faced a woman who had once held so much power. "Do you really think you can run from this now, Tiffany?" The former treasurer spat, her voice sharp for a brief moment. Henyard seemed caught off guard. The woman who had once controlled everything was now on the receiving end of an indictment, not from courts, but from someone who knew her all too well. The press, sensing the chance for even more drama, turned their cameras toward the confrontation. It felt like the final act in a long, painful saga. Would Henyard try to deflect, or had the truth finally cornered her beyond escape? The people of Dalton, who had watched the charade unfold for so long, now found themselves on the edge of history. Would this be the moment they finally saw their city freed from the grip of its controversial leader? And as Henyard stood in the middle of a media storm, she knew this was one fight she couldn't win. The courtroom was thick with tension, the air practically crackling with anticipation. Reporters clicked away with their cameras, while murmurs rippled through the audience. At the center of it all sat Tiffany Henyard, the so-called super mayor, once untouchable, now the personification of defiance. She had entered the courtroom with the same arrogance that had defined her entire political career, her chin high, her eyes full of unshakable confidence. Behind her were a group of lawyers, likely paid with taxpayer money. But that didn't seem to faze her. Then came the bombshell of prosecution, unleashed a barrage of evidence that rocked the room. Leaked statements, emails, and recordings all displayed Henyard's involvement in bribery, backdoor deals, and the misuse of taxpayer funds. The room fell silent as the contents flashed on the courtroom's big screen. Every secret, every manipulation laid bare. Henyard, once known for her smooth talk and carefully crafted public persona, froze. Her carefully constructed mask cracked. She sat still. Her face drained of color as the truth poured into the room like a flood. The residents of Dalton, who had once placed their trust in her, sat in stunned silence. The woman they had believed in for so long was no longer the powerful leader they thought they knew. She was exposed, her empire of lies unraveling before their eyes. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. In a fit of rage, Henyard slammed her fist onto the table so forcefully that her chair screeched across the polished floor. She stood, her eyes blazing with fury, and screamed, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked with emotion. The room, however, remained unmoved. The judge's gavel pounded for order, but Henyard refused to back down. She pointed an accusatory finger at the prosecution, shouting, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony hung thick in the air. Here was a woman who had used her position to bully local officials, inflate salaries, and funnel money into dubious projects, now trying to cast herself as a victim. It was a classic Henyard move, playing the martyr when the walls closed, and then, in a desperate last attempt to salvage her image, Henyard turned on her own lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. One of her lawyers shuffled awkwardly through papers, clearly embarrassed, while the other refused to meet her eyes. The cracks in her carefully crafted empire were now impossible to ignore. The truth had finally caught up with her, and she had no answers, no spin left to offer. It was over in a shocking and dramatic move. Henyard grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. The gasps that followed were audible. For the first time in her political career, Henyard couldn't control the narrative. She was walking away from the fight, and the public was watching the room, once filled with tension, now buzzed with whispers. The once unstoppable mayor was fleeing. The power she had held over Dalton for years was slipping from her grasp. And then, something unexpected happened. The former treasurer of Dalton, a woman who had resigned months earlier after alleging financial mismanagement and corruption, stepped forward and blocked Henyard's path. This was the same woman who had been bullied and threatened by Henyard's administration. But now she was determined not to let this moment slip away. She was not about to let Henyard walk away without facing the truth. "You can run out of court, but you can't run from the truth, Tiffany," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension for the first time that day. Henyard faltered. She froze for a brief moment. A crack in her armor, the facade that had protected her for so long, was beginning to crumble. But the former treasurer wasn't done. "You silenced all of us. But guess what?" she continued, her voice growing bolder as the cameras clicked and rolled. "You can't silence the truth." The crowd gathered, the pressure mounting on Henyard, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Despite her discomfort, she hesitated to walk away. Then, in an impulsive and reckless move, she stepped forward, getting inches away from the former treasurer's face. In a low, threatening whisper, she muttered something, but Henyard had underestimated the power of live streaming. The former treasurer, smirking, turned directly to the cameras and declared, "You heard that right. She just threatened me again." And with that, social media exploded. The hashtag #KenrodDringGore began trending within seconds, and the world watched as Henyard's political career unraveled before their very eyes. The power dynamic had shifted. It was no longer Henyard dictating the narrative. Now, the truth was out, and the people of Dalton were demanding answers. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Henyard's hearing continued without her. The prosecution, now free from the mayor's influence, presented even more damning evidence. They displayed records of millions of taxpayer dollars gone missing, secret backdoor deals, and of course, the infamous recordings that had been hidden for so long. Without Henyard there to control the narrative, the prosecution laid everything out in the open, unraveling the empire she had so carefully built. The evidence was overwhelming. A staggering $30 million in financial discrepancies were revealed. The room reacted with shock and disbelief. Henyard's manipulations, her lies, and her deceit were now undeniable. The prosecution went on, unrelenting. "Your Honor, we have uncovered a series of financial transactions totaling over $30 million, the lead attorney said, his voice steady but laden with the weight of the revelations. The room was in stunned silence as the audience absorbed the enormity of the numbers. This wasn't a case of simple mismanagement or financial missteps. This was full-blown embezzlement. The prosecution clicked through a series of records, sending shockwaves through the room. There were shell companies, fake invoices, and mysterious consulting fees, all pointing directly to Henyard and her closest allies. The most damning piece of evidence? Some of those transactions weren't even linked to Dalton. They connected to luxury properties in other states. Properties that should have been invested in Dalton's infrastructure, safety, and public programs, but had instead been funneled into high-end real estate. Elsewhere, the courtroom buzzed with one question. Asked her who owned those properties. The answer came, and it was devastating. Henyard's inner circle, her closest advisors, had been implicated, and allegedly, her own boyfriend had ties to some of those properties. The same boyfriend who had been conspicuously absent from the courtroom that day as the prosecution laid out the undeniable web of corruption. Henyard's fate became clear. There was no more room for doubt. This wasn't political mismanagement or a series of unfortunate mistakes. It was criminal behavior, intentional and malicious, and Henyard wasn't even present to defend herself. The judge, her voice booming with authority, made a monumental announcement. It is within the court's power to authorize an official criminal investigation into Mayor Henyard's financial dealings. The room fell into silence as the magnitude of the moment settled in. An official criminal investigation was now underway, one that could lead to federal charges. For the residents of Dalton, who had long whispered about Henyard's misdeeds, this was a moment of justice. What had once been mere gossip and rumors was now a concrete case, a full-fledged investigation with potential for serious consequences. Henyard's days in power were numbered as the news broke. A crowd of Dalton residents gathered outside the courthouse. Their frustration, which had built over the years, finally found release. When they heard the verdict, they erupted into cheers. "Lock her up. We finally got her," the crowd chanted, their voices rising in a wave of triumphant energy. The atmosphere was electric, but Henyard, still caught in a media frenzy just a few blocks away, had no idea what was unfolding inside the courthouse. She believed she could still spin the situation, play the victim, and twist the narrative in her favor. But what she didn't realize was that her empire was already crumbling as the cheers outside grew louder. The reality of her situation began to sink in. For years, Henyard had ruled Dalton with an iron fist. She had silenced critics, bullied whistleblowers, and manipulated the system with ruthless efficiency. But now, for the first time, the system was fighting back inside the car. Henyard's phone rang. It was one of her closest advisors. She hesitated before answering, her voice dripping with frustration. "What?" She snapped. A frantic voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Madam Mayor, it's bad. Real bad." Henyard clenched her jaw, bracing herself. How bad? A moment of silence passed, and then the words tumbled out, sealing her fate. "The investigation, it's federal. They're coming after you." Her heart skipped a beat. Federal charges. That wasn't just another political scandal. This was a full-blown criminal case, and there would be no escaping it. Henyard exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the weight of what was happening began to crush her. For the first time in her career, she had nowhere to run, no narrative to spin, and no victory card to play. The power she had wielded with such ruthless precision was slipping through her fingers. Calls and messages kept coming, but Henyard had already lost control. The leaks, the tapes, the mounting evidence. It was all too much. The life she had carefully constructed, built on a foundation of corruption, intimidation, and deceit, was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it inside the courthouse. The judge's decision was final. The criminal investigation was authorized. The rumors and whispers had finally been confirmed. The truth had been laid bare, and no amount of political maneuvering could save her. Now the people of Dalton, once silenced, were now seeing justice served. The courthouse erupted into a celebration as Henyard's downfall became inevitable. Outside, the crowd chanted for her to be locked up, while inside the courtroom, the weight of her past actions bore down on her as Henyard sat in her car. The cheers in the crowd outside grew louder. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, but she didn't answer. The reality of her situation was sinking in. Federal charges were coming, and she was no longer the untouchable political force she once believed herself to be. Her empire had crumbled. The truth had come for her, and now there was no place left to hide. Tiffany Henyard had once been the most powerful, feared, and untouchable leader Dalton had ever known. A political force who had manipulated, bullied, and deceived her way to the top. She had ruled the city with an iron fist. For years, she had been able to escape the consequences of her actions, spinning narratives, intimidating critics, and silencing anyone who dared to speak out. But now, in an instant, everything had changed. She sat alone in her car, the chaos unfolding around her. The cheers of the crowd outside the courthouse grew louder, a stark contrast to the panic rising within her chest. Tiffany Henyard was no longer a powerful mayor. She was a fugitive from justice. Her grip on power had evaporated, and the world was watching her unravel for the first time in her life. Tiffany Henyard felt completely isolated. The police officers who had once been her personal security detail were now law enforcement officials, waiting for their orders to take action. Her loyal staff, those who had once done her bidding without question, had scattered, leaving her with no support. Even her lawyer, who had been by her side through every scandal, avoided eye contact, deepening her sense of abandonment, and the man who had been with her through every crisis, the man who had once been her biggest ally, was nowhere to be found. The same boyfriend who had stood by her side in the face of controversy was now absent. Tiffany had burned too many bridges, and now, in her moment of greatest need, she stood alone, the panic gripping her tightened its hold. She had always been able to talk her way out of tight situations, to find a way to manipulate the narrative and escape the consequences. But this time it was different. The phone buzzed incessantly in her hand, a reminder of how quickly her world had spiraled into chaos. She stared at the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. She already knew the truth. They're coming after everything, she muttered to herself. Everything. Her administration's finances, her personal transactions, her hidden accounts, the luxury property she owned in other states. They were all under scrutiny. Panic gripped her heart as the weight of the situation slammed into her with full force. She glanced around for an escape, but there was no one to help her. For the first time in her political career, Tiffany Henyard was completely alone. The consequences of her actions were no longer just a matter of public opinion. They were real, and they were coming for her across town. News channels were covering the unfolding chaos in real time. The headlines screamed the bombshell: Asterisk Henyard under criminal investigation. Full financial probe into corruption scandal explodes. Asterisk, the situation was unbearable. And then came the shock that Tiffany Henyard could not have anticipated. A whistleblower from her own office stepped forward with devastating evidence. "I worked in that office for years," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw how the money moved, how taxpayer dollars were funneled into private accounts. And when I tried to speak up, I was threatened." The interviewer leaned in, wide-eyed with disbelief. "Threatened by who?" Without hesitation, the woman replied. "By Tiffany." Henyard herself. Gasps erupted from the audience. The interviewer's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're saying Mayor Henyard directly threatened you?" "Yes," the whistleblower confirmed, her voice growing steady with resolve. "Not just me. Anyone who got in her way." The camera zoomed in on the whistleblower as she pulled out a small black recorder from her purse. "I have proof," she said. "I recorded everything." The newsroom fell silent. The evidence was undeniable. Tiffany Henyard, the woman who had spent years using intimidation and fear to silence her critics, was now facing the consequences of her own actions. The very people she had bullied and threatened were fighting back, armed with the proof needed to take her down back inside the courthouse. The prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor," the lead attorney began, standing tall and confident before the court, "given the overwhelming evidence presented today, we request that law enforcement begin an immediate investigation into all financial transactions linked to Mayor Henyard's office." The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Tiffany Henyard, standing at the center of it all, felt the walls closing in around her. For so long, she had believed she was untouchable, above the law. But now, with the full force of law enforcement closing in and federal authorities poised to investigate her every move, she knew her reign was over outside the courthouse. The energy was palpable. The crowd had gathered in full force, their cheers loud and triumphant. News of Henyard's impending downfall had spread like wildfire through Dalton, igniting a fire of anger and celebration. "Lock her up," they chanted. Justice for Dalton. The atmosphere was electric as protesters waved signs demanding accountability, their voices rising in unison. One particularly striking protester held up a banner that twisted Henyard's own campaign slogan, "For the people," into a brutal commentary on her years of corruption and abuse of power. For her wallet. The crowd roared in approval, and just when Tiffany Henyard thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The first arrest warrant was issued, but it wasn't for her, not yet. The warrant was for someone very close to her. Her top financial advisor. Reporters scrambled to confirm the breaking news. Sources revealed that authorities had issued an arrest warrant for this high-ranking member of Henyard's administration. And then came the real shock. The FBI was now involved. Henyard was no longer just facing a local investigation. It had gone federal. The weight of this revelation hit Tiffany like a ton of bricks. Panic gripped her as she turned to her lawyer, her voice tight with desperation. "Fix this," she demanded. But her lawyer didn't respond with the usual confidence. Instead, he gave her a look that spoke volumes. It said, "Even I can't save you now." In that moment, Tiffany Henyard fully grasped the reality of her situation. She wasn't in control anymore. The days of dodging accountability with empty statements, brushing off accusations with a smile, and intimidating critics into silence were over. Her fall from grace was in full swing. Frozen, she stared outside her car at the growing crowd, watching her political empire crumble before her eyes. She realized this wasn't just another PR nightmare she could spin away. This was the end. The people of Dalton, who had suffered for so long under her rule, were no longer passive observers. They were celebrating her downfall, cheering for justice to finally be served. For years, Henyard had built her empire on corruption, shady deals, and a complete disregard for the people she was supposed to serve. But now, the reckoning had arrived. Justice was finally catching up to Tiffany Henyard, and there was no escape as the news spread. Attention shifted to the deepening investigation. The next question on everyone's mind was whether this was just the beginning. The financial probe was still unfolding, and with the FBI now involved, the scope of the investigation was expanding. Authorities were closing in on her every move. The walls were tightening, and more arrests seemed inevitable. People close to Henyard were already flipping, providing key information to investigators, making her situation even worse. The question now was, would Tiffany Henyard try to cut a deal to save herself, or would she attempt a last-ditch effort to escape before the hammer truly dropped? Time was running out. Her options were dwindling fast. The people of Dalton, who had been deceived, manipulated, and used for Henyard's own gain, watched with growing anticipation. They had longed for the moment when justice would finally be served. This was not just another political scandal. It was a long-awaited reckoning. The question was, would Tiffany Henyard face the consequences of her actions, or would she try to outrun them one last time in the background? The situation continued to unfold. The financial investigation was still in its early stages, and with the FBI now involved, it was clear that this was only the beginning. As more updates were expected in the coming days, the public remained on edge, watching as the situation developed. The stakes had never been higher. Tiffany Henyard's empire might have been crumbling, but her downfall was just getting started. The story was far from over, and as the investigation continued, the world watched, waiting for the next chapter. Would she face justice, or would she attempt a final escape? The clock was ticking, and Tiffany Henyard could no longer hide behind the web of lies and manipulation that had once protected her. The truth had come for her, and this time, there was no escaping it. Thank you for watching Celeb News.